You know, sometimes, do you ever just laugh internally? But I decided I was going to share this, okay? So the only piece of scrap paper that I actually had just to write a couple of notes down was a warning speeding ticket. So that can be your laugh for today. But thank you so much, Tim, for inviting me, and I'm assuming it's the right. We'll just practice. Yeah, there we go. Okay. My name is Gretchen Johnson, and I serve as the CEO of DaVinciSKY Group. We have several subsidiaries and from drones and helicopters and all kinds of technology with SERDI cameras that look like little Google cars. And we do about anything on the grid. We run around with cameras, and that's just part of our daily life. So Tim invited me to talk a little bit about the drones, and I could be your salesperson when I retire on that deterrent drone. On SIP protocol stations, that could be my gig. So we'll talk about that. And I've got an idea too. So, but this is our company group. If anybody, you can find us under DaVinciSKY Group. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about automation, software. And you know, it really doesn't matter what industry you're in. You know, distribution lines, transmission lines, substations, underground, you know, all of that is in my area. But whether or not you're on a gas pipeline, a lot of the automation that you see behind the drones, it's all very similar. And most of the time, those are configurable and they will meet your needs. So if you ever have any I don't just talk about the electric grid. I'm pretty well versed in pipeline and any other thing that you'd like to discuss, anything that can like make my mind think above and beyond. 5 years ago, I was saying there's going to be a drone in a box. There is, and everybody's like, oh, we'll never get there. Well, guess what? We just saw a drone in a box, right? And we're going to see more and more of those applications, whether it's for security, whether it's for the grid, whether it's for the pipeline. We're going to start seeing those, and you know, I think I've never. It's funny sometimes when you're sitting into an audience and you start hearing people talk, and they talk about, you know, the drones, that it's really hard with the FAA, and you know, I've never had that problem, and probably so is because I started off in helicopters, right? So when we call up, they know who we are, and they're probably more suited to grant us a drone clearance than a helicopter. They're like, hey, that's just only 9 inches, right? So anyway, we're going to kind of go through a couple of things, and I thought just to start us off with some fun facts other than my speeding warning. Here's a few ways drones are coming into play. Cows with fevers, you know, but you got to make sure somebody's out there with the cow because you got to get the right cow, right? So, but there's actually automation in that the guy actually gets the cow and he brings that cow back onto the stall. I'm not a good farmer. Chasing criminals to get an ID. Now you can go low in the security. Used to, they would say you still had to remain above 50, 60 feet for ID. Now they allow them, if you are 2 inches above their head to get an ID, you can do it. Drones that clean a window. That is something to look up and something to watch in your skyscraper cities. We've seen those people hanging. You know, we actually have men that hang from a rope, you know, and we put them on a pole with a helicopter. Well, those guys would actually, they were hanging from the tops of skyscrapers, you know, 200 feet higher than what we were. Most of the time we're, you know, 100, 200 feet. Drones delivering internet access. You know, you see this a lot in remote places. Up in Alaska, I was a principal engineer on really improving the environment. And one of the things, Scott Trilliant was involved. We had energy hub meters. You know, in Alaska, especially in the smaller villages, it's really not kind of what car you drive. It's more about what kind of refrigerator you have, because they are still very agrarian. So when we're looking at those, the drones were the very first that we were using probably, I was in my 40s back then, so 10 years ago, and we were using drones to actually provide the internet service so we could test the sky clearance, right? So even 10 years ago, we were doing some of that. Walt Disney light shows, right down the road. And then America's Got Talent. They use it to do the lights for different folks. So I just thought that was fun. In the utility world, so let's get down to brass tacks. And like I said, whether you're in the gas, pipeline, automation, robotics, whatever industry you're in, all of this, they are kissing cousins. So just because I want you to think about your industry and, do some deduction and connection and see how this fits in what you're doing. So drone technology and applications in the power industry is growing at a rapid pace. We know that. We see it coming. Some more standardization with the FAA is really needed. And we've got to get some comfort level. And there's going to have to be some very well understood advocates that can basically lobby the FAA to come on out and get us comfortable with drones. So high definition imagery, LiDAR, photogrammetry. Photogrammetry is totally underrated within my sector, which is the grid. You feel my pain. I go into electric utilities, and I've got this one guy, and I go see him every year, and he is adamant that he is going to use LiDAR instead of photogrammetry. And I'm like, why would you do that when we can run that for $100 a mile versus $600 a mile? And, because really you're just looking for a medium, right? And the drone does a very good job of giving you that medium. We're not looking for mantle photography. We're looking for enough to make a very evaluated situation on how we're going to repair a pipeline, a power line, a generation station, whatever we're repairing. We just need enough information to make the repair, right? Tower inspection, storm assessment, and corona applications, ultraviolet. Nobody really uses those correctly, so I just put both, okay? So that way we're all clear, we know what we're talking about. Storm assessment, let me just kind of plug this. I would like to see, a lot of times we go into storm-ridden areas, and I've served as the principal engineer on 2 storms. One was Sandy and one was Puerto Rico. Both very, very different dynamics. Silt was a big performer of one, and then just underlying vegetation to where it was an Easter egg hunt, just trying to find a power line to get it up. And a lot of the storm, what happens is we go in after the power first to get power back up. But in Hurricane Sandy and Rita and those that was called for. It was a necessity. It was very much needed. But in Puerto Rico, we had to be airborne no matter what you did. Either you had to have a drone or you had to have a helicopter or a small fixed wing. And whatever we were capturing at that time, just enough data, because there had been so much erosion that the roads were unclearable. So I would like to see a little bit more around FEMA, the storm assessment area. I would like to see some fencing in of certain standards before we just go headfirst into the power sector. And there are places where we just can't go, right? We just cannot go to Land Bureau restricted areas. You guys, I tell this story when I was so excited. This was like, I was in sales before I owned a company, and I went in and I got this huge thing with El Paso, and I was so excited, and it was my first real inspection with helicopters, a little bit of drone activity. We were having IR, we were doing some corona, we were doing some high definition imagery, and it was just kind of the bomb, right? Well, I didn't realize that I had 7 entities that I needed to communicate with, one of which was Ted Turner's Buffalo Ranch, and then I had a missile place that I got in trouble with, you know. And so despite my sales, I did not realize that they were that strict. I just thought, I'm out here, I'm doing you a favor, you know. Oh, no. So I learned real quick, compliance is everything, right? Compliance translates into getting paid. So I learned that, and then I was off to the races. Indian burial grounds and other protected areas out in SoCal, Edison, the valley wasn't deep enough to bring a fixed wing plane in to get the vegetation scale, to get we needed all kinds of measurements on this power line that was back from 1930. So we were working around all these perimeters, and drones had just really came onto the market. And sure enough, we were able to go to their PUC, and we were able to get some clearance to go in and take a look, and we were allowed only so many steps, and we had to walk on the outside. So there are places where drones cannot be without permission from a PUC. And Indian burial grounds, that is one of them. State parks create their own governing, and a lot of people don't know this. So in Yellowstone, sometimes you're allowed, sometimes you're not. Carlsbad Cavern, you're never allowed, right? So each one of them do their own guidelines, and each one of them, they come up with their own governing around drones, helicopters, fixed wing, anything that's going to be capturing or automating data. Camp David, we kind of understand that, right? We get it. Minnesota and Missouri, restricted areas. So this is kind of interesting that we have 2 states that they do not allow any drone activity over neighborhoods for people that might be sunbathing by their pool. I have a real funny story. We hired Georgia Tech graduates, and they were in our data processing. You know, they were software engineers, and so we would let them come in, and they were all over there just snickering, and I walked over there, and they were all like trying to click everything off, and sure enough, we had some nudists around that the drone had actually captured at 60 feet. So that might be, I don't know if it was from that state, but possibly. And the Bush Ranch, and then Pantex Nuclear Assembly, and 12 other areas. So with this, there comes a high level of compliance, and especially when you're within airports, whether it be an FBO or whether it be an international or a Class B airport, okay? And you're all going to be able to work within zones on how low you can go, right? Kind of like that song, you know? So that we always need to be mindful, and we also need to look at the surroundings before we enter an area with a drone, and especially when it's going to have software animation behind it. So line tower and routine tower inspections, one of the routine parts of a utility is site inspection. You know, one of the things that we need to realize is 5.5 million lines of distro and over 200,000 miles of high voltage, okay? So that's 230 kV and above. They've kind of brought it down. It used to be 345. Now it goes to about 230. A lot of the 230 lines that are operating as 230 lines actually are built as 345 lines so that they do not have to go back and rebuild again. So that's very common in the industry, in the energy industry right now. So even though it's running as a 230, it's probably the capabilities, especially if it's been built in the past, say 5 or 6 years, it's probably built to 345, and if it's 345, it's probably built to 500 specs. If it's 500, it's built to 700 specs. So that kind of tells us. So when we think about 5.5 million miles and we think about the demographics that you live in, okay? And everybody knows that the distro lines are the little bitty lines that we see kind of flanking our side streets, and probably some of them now, especially if you have a very active EMC or you are near to a independently IOU, that's going to be your big boys, you know. Those now, a lot of times they're trying to consolidate poles so that there's not so much pole pollution that we see. So with that being said, drones are an excellent way because we're not going to be bringing in helicopters. We really don't want to do foot patrols anymore. That's kind of out, other than on substations. And then, too, we've got to be able to capture that data because the U.S. government, basically between NERC and FERC, are saying, we want to know the condition of your lines. So with regulatory, with the state and the feds both wanting that kind of information, the drone is a perfect opportunity to be able to capture that data, push it into a database, and then with that database, you should be able to disseminate it and have visibility throughout whatever you're looking at, whether it be gas, oil, the distro, or the T-line. Okay, and even substations. You know, helicopters, a lot of times utilities will kind of, we'll get on to site with a helicopter and they'll go, can you just run around the substation with your IR gimbal? And it's like, no, substations and helicopters equal bacon. And we're not going to do that, right? And that goes for pipelines too. So those of you that are in pipelines, even with a helicopter, you talk about a maintenance program that really needs to be, intact, is a helicopter that's flying down a pipeline, okay? Don't get me wrong, transmission lines are important too, but, helicopters flying low with an apogee or an ALMA system, because that's really what you need to get to. You need to get to a miniature apogee or ALMA system so you can run it in snow or you can still do the detection. And so when we're talking about those systems and we want to make them smaller, we want to make them lighter, we want to make the infrastructure so that if it did collide with something, that it has a transmissional dissemination, right? And that's what we've got to get to. And, that is really when we increase the sustainability, if there is ever an action that is a crash, whether it be helicopter, drone, fixed wing, whatever it is, that it's very minimal, right? And that we're getting the people out of the way first, right? Always first. And I loved in another session, it had a circle and it said the economics are driving it, not the people, right? And so we've got to get to the point to where when we're looking at these solutions that we're making them where they can dismantle themselves before they actually hit the ground. That's where we need to be eventually. So here's some sample data sets. I always like to have everything geotagged, comprehensive visual inspections. A lot of times that's just high definition. There's plenty of plug-and-play drones out there. I've got a couple of favorites, and I never, tell that on a platform, because you never know. Somebody else may have something better, and I just don't know it yet, right? So, but infrared, corona, geotagged HD imagery. I also like the DVR. So when I'm looking at a drone, I'm really looking at the capability for it to do about 4 to 5 different functions at one time. And again, this is applicable substations, power generations, tower erections, QCC. Those of you that are building pipelines, those of you that are building roofing, those of you that may work in a heavy machinery. One of my favorite things, my husband was now I can't tell this yet, but my husband used to fly for Drummond Cole, and he would go back and forth to Columbia. And when his boss learned that we had drones, he was like, hey, can you fly that drone down into the mine and, give us a good idea of what's down there and, where you see the hot spots on the belting? And I thought, yes, that's totally different for us to look at. And so we were able to do that. And so, like I said, just because we're talking about power lines, and that's kind of, what I know, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not applicable to what you are using things for today. Again, software is configurable. Esri, I have never seen a place where Esri cannot go over and it is usable. I love drone to map. I even use drone to map in a helicopter arena. They would probably die if I said that. So, can you clip that out? But I really like to use that in the helicopter arena because I am able to create data sets. And I'm just totally amused that nobody has done that in that arena and called it helicopter to map. I don't know. But here you can see that high definition imagery, these are so close, the pixels will actually, they'll go to about 27. Then we also can just do up close and personal, when we're looking at different components, and then also just in the generation plants. So I always use a remote geodigital, and if you end up inquiring on remote geodigital, it's Jeff Dawkey. He's out of Colorado. I am one of his biggest fans, and I use that for almost anything and everything that we do on the grid. And just right now, it's a plug and play. It's easy. It's the end users, the ease for, if you're pushing it to a pipeline company, if you're pushing it to an energy company or a ground contractor for QCC, it's just got an ease about it that is extremely user-friendly on both ends. It's not this technical, having to click through, figuring out where to drag it, and then, making sure that it hits the share drive in a certain, it can transpose back and forth with different kind of readers. It's just very easy to use. Here's a sample of some LiDAR mapping. My head shaker right here when I was talking about photogrammetry and LiDAR, you're usually talking by the time that you build your assumptions and whether or not you're mapping a pipeline, whether you're mapping that power grid for clearances, SAG, whatever you're looking for. You may be looking at a road, you may have several stakeholders, and this is the difference between photogrammetry and LiDAR on a drone, okay? The number one difference is if it is a construction project that has many stakeholders, you are going to want to run that drone with LiDAR, right? Because we're going to get down into sub-meter accuracy. Because let's say that we're going to take a 4-lane road and we're going to expand it to 8. And we got a Chevron station right here, we got a dry cleaners right here, we've got some pad mounts over here, and then over here we've got a gas, natural gas pipeline at the city gate, right? So we've got something on each corners. So once you get over 2 stakeholders, no matter what you do, you're going to run LiDAR. Right? That keeps everybody clean and it keeps everybody informed, and then that will make the project run so much better. Photogrammetry is a little different. It's just going to give you a median, right? And it's not going to be able to give you sub-meter measurements. So when you get into construction projects with various stakeholders, you're always going to use a LiDAR measurement with a sub-meter, okay? Here, survey grade LiDAR, 0.5, ortho imagery, mosaics. The drone does an exceptional job with mosaics. You know, we can get low, and you are able to definitely define what you're looking at. At one time, I had just gotten into LiDAR, and I'd hired this, he was pretty new, he was out of college, and I was very impressed with, you know, what he had been a part of, and I got to looking, and I was like, I don't think that's a power line, I think that's a river. I was like, I'm pretty sure it's a river. And so when you're making your assumptions, just make sure you've got somebody making those assumptions that are the right assumptions, okay? Because we don't need a power line named a river, right? So, all right. And then here's just a set of samples. I think imagery, a lot of times, it can just speak volumes with what we can see and what we're able to fix. Here's another data set. One of the things that we ended up, you know, you end up with sometimes you end up in places you never thought you'd go. Well, this is one of them. And we ended up doing the LNG tanks. And quite frankly, I just never knew that there was a need to measure that vapor barrier with LNG tanks. So this is up at BG&E, and you can definitely tell where there's leaks. We can, you know, there was just all different types of things we were able to see with that vapor barrier. Uses in storms, I've kind of covered that a little bit, with natural disaster, storm damage, trees. You know, we have got to get to where the environment is a part of the power grid. And you guys, it took me a long time to kind of get to that. You know, I've been in transmission since I was 30. So, and back then, we had data asset management, but we didn't call it that. It was like, get this stuff organized so we can see what we're dealing with. That's what we called it. That's how long ago that was. And now we call it data asset management, you know, but we've got to get to the point to where when we're looking at data and we're actually storing the data that we are getting from all of these different types of drones. You know, I love the deterrent drone. I've got ideas for that. And when we're looking at that, we've somehow got to organize this data. And so, because we can't get so inundated with data that you're not using it, and that you're spending 6 and 7 months on organizing it, and then you're using it for 3 minutes to make decisions about a project, right? And basically, too, when you're going to fly that drone, whether it be over a pipeline, whether it be over a roof, whether it be on a power grid or a SIP protocol station, whatever you're using it for, make sure that you're communicating with other departments. Hey, we're going to have a drone out there. What do you need to see? Right? So that you're not repeating work that's already being done, and you can get it in one run. Because you're going to pay a minimum, no matter what, for drone services. If they're going to be out there for an hour, you're going to pay a minimum of 3 hours. So you need to make sure that you're talking among your departments. Where we are falling short. All right, and I think these are some of the hang-ups with the FAA. This is why they don't know what to do with us yet, okay? It took a long time for the helicopters to get where we are, and that is why helicopters, even with that footprint, are easier to work with than drones. Number one, we've already got a vetting process. We vet those pilots. We know what they're capable of. We know how many hours they've done wire. We know how many hours they've done human external cargo. We know how many hours they flew just ferrying. We know their height, their weight, their heart condition, right? We know what they're doing. So the vetting process, we have got to come up with a way to vet drone operators. And I think that that would bring a comfort level with the FAA, right? Required insurances. You know, when the helicopter comes on site, they know that we are stacked with insurance, There is no doubt about it. We have insured everybody within 50 miles, right, with what we pay. And they just aren't sure with a drone, and even the insurance companies aren't sure with the drone. The utilities aren't sure how much insurance they need with that drone. So we've got to kind of bring that in and kind of wrangle the masses so that we can go to the FAA with a plan, right? We've got to get a plan, and we've got to have one that looks comprehensible so that we're talking about all of these. Again, background checks. People that fly helicopters, they're not criminals, right? They've been through a background check. If they are on that utility property, they already know in my contract I have signed on the dotted line that they have had a background check and that they are good to go. We don't have that yet with drone operations. We've got to get there. ISN safety ratings. How many of you are familiar with ISN? Okay. ISN users, Avetta, Ariba, we can go on and on, right? Power Advocate, you name it. They put us through the gamut. We've got to get some platforms that kind of help us with that and bring some credibility to what we're doing. Equipment vetting. What kind of drone are you using? Why are you using that kind of drone? We don't want that. I've always been amused. Somebody was like, I saw on LinkedIn one time they had a gas-powered drone right next to, they were saying how they were inspecting a 500 kV line. Now, if there's any corona activity on a 500 kV line and there is a gas-powered drone, we are in trouble, right? That does not make sense. So I was like, maybe you need to take that down, And so requirements for purchase. What do you purchase with a drone? Share drive requirements. What are you going to do to make sure that when you push that data back to me, what does that look like? And how are you ensuring that because you are filming this part of the grid, what are you doing with that? And where are your backups? Like, we are stationed in Birmingham, Alabama. We use Bluehost. Bluehost goes to one city, then one city goes to the other city, right? So we're all the way backed up to the west, but we're working on the east, right? And then vice versa. Backup requirements. How long are you going to keep this on your database? And then last but not least, data processing. Are you keeping the data that you have gotten off of our pipes, our poles, whatever you're looking at? Have you sent that offshore? Okay? And so those are some of the things that I think if we could actually bring some regulatory around those, we would see the drone business move a little faster in these arenas. And then that's my contact. And then I've got my little notes. I'm going to kind of run down through these. I talked a little bit about the El Paso job. I think that's an important one. North Attleboro in Massachusetts. I meant to tell you, Tim, about that. We did a pilot study there, and we were able to get 438 pole tops. They wanted to know what the condition of the pole top looked like. In our industry, the condition of the pole top actually can create IR, and then you get a little humidity laying on the line, and then it can burst into flames. Have you ever seen a transformer blow? A lot of times on the distro line, that's what's causing it. So 438 pole tops in one day. Tethering drones for SIP protocol. I think that is another. I think that could kind of go in line with what these gentlemen were talking about and what that looks like. Apogee Alma systems that we are running on helicopters. I think if we could condense those models, put those on some drones, that would be a great pipeline. Future drone in a box. I'm totally in agreement with that. And then in closing, as far as sustainability, drones will enable us to knock out approximately 14 million truck rolls in 1 year. So just think about that. For every truck roll, now this is coming out of the south, okay? So if it's in the south, double it for the north, and I have no idea what California would charge, okay? But I'm just saying, this is in the south. $6.26 per mile per truck roll. Do the math. So when we're looking at sustainability and how drones can interact and help our environment, that's a great place to start.